All right, we are now live on YouTube.
Thank you, Monica. Good afternoon, commissioners, staff, and community. Today is May 18th, and we are here to discuss a first day on regarding a budget. And I'd like to call this meeting to order and turn it over to our budget staff and our county manager.
Good afternoon, board. I trust that you are well, and we look forward to this discussion today. I sent an email noting that because we covered much ground in
Commissioner Carter, while we're waiting here, just I know David asked Claudia for a copy of the updated MOU that the school system
He doesn't know he's on.
Sent out. Claudia, do we have a copy of that yet?
Keith, I was doing my introduction and you interrupted. Yeah, he can't hear me. Hey, Keith, can you hear me?
Claudia, I'll mute it, or he's muted now.
It's okay. I'm gonna start all over.
Whole
It's
thing.
my day.
I'll send him a text.
Good afternoon. I sent out a note earlier that we would have a shorter meeting than originally budgeted time-wise. And part of that was because we covered the Durham Public Schools budget in the morning session in greater detail than planned. When we put the agenda together, it was before we realized that the joint meeting happened at the same day. Nevertheless, that does give us some time to delve into the overall budget, looking at the trends and patterns, et cetera, a little more, but it does also allow us to end earlier than planned. And since this has been a long day already, I know that's helpful for everyone's schedule. And Keith, I know he mentioned the agreement.
Oh, you? Yes, ma'am.
And so I know you wanted to make sure that staff got a copy of that as well. So we'll follow up. So we'll do our due diligence on that. And I'll turn it over to Keith for him to start some of these conversations, and we'll take throughout this discussion.
Getting lots of beeps here. Sorry, Claudia, I was on my earphones, lost it there. When you say start conversation, you're talking about the agenda. Is that what we want to go over real quick? David, if you'll pull up the agenda for me, please, for us, for the commissioners.
And I can start some of that, and then we can kick it
Sure,
back.
either way.
Yeah, so our tentative schedule originally was to cover the DPS budget, and then have some conversation about the overall budget overview. And the end part of the day was open, and it often ends early on that first day when we're covering general conversations with the board. During that period, you may identify areas you'd like for us to talk about that may not be listed on the draft timeline. And we also know that we will get questions from you, and y'all are still working through that budget document. It's a pretty full document, so we know you're not quite finished with all of it, but as you also go through that process, we will help fill in components for discussion. And so we have a tentative framework for the 27th to talk about the ARPA funds next steps. And it's, again, very broad framework and how that process we're proposing for it to flow, as well as it's a tentative, and we have to firm up this about the vaccine equity proposal to make sure this the timeline works too with the public health director. At the 2 o'clock timeframe, we're proposing that we talk about the DSS Phase 3 Medicaid support in their budget request, and we will have some conversation about the DSS subsidy that's proposed to support our taxpayers that are 30% or less of the AMI. On June 1st, we'll shift to some of the economic development initiatives, and we'll also tentatively have Durham Technical Community College to talk about their initiatives. As you may recall, they had a larger ask than we could afford at this juncture with local dollars, but we also, in looking at the workforce development components, did see those as areas as possible places that we could use some of our ARPA funds. But again, we'll have more conversations with that. We did plug a time for the Office of Sheriff. We would share on that June 1st meeting the update on the employee COLA and merit rate information. Part of the reason we pushed that to the June 1st timeframe, because we're also trying to make sure we have all of the benchmark data that we use to compare where we are with our peers as we're trying to gauge what other jurisdictions are doing. The 3 o'clock timeframe, we would have some conversation about minority maternal health infrastructure and next steps. I did send some information to the board about that framework, but we'll have a more formal discussion. Now, there's a lot of places that say to be determined, but that's so that we can flesh those out. I know today we may have some, but I know once we get your feedback, and we can make sure we get that by the end of the week as far as possible topics, that'll help us firm up the calendar for those outlying dates. So that gives you some framework of what we were thinking, and we can now sort of go to some of the other discussion items you may have had.
Well, it was my hope today. Thank you, Claudia. Sorry for interrupting you earlier. Apparently I did and didn't know it. My mistake.
That provides
Technology.
economic relief for people. Yeah.
Okay. Well, I'm sorry to interrupt. It was our hope today to continue the DPS discussion with the board, but apparently the Board of Education had other things. We can always bring them back, but I'm not sure that we need the Board of Education here unless you all have questions for them, and we can convey those questions to the board. But we may want to go over how our board feels about the DPS budget recommendation from the manager, and if there are any changes to that, if there are questions or directives, we're happy to go over that. We also set up a brief time to go over a budget overview, but honestly, that budget overview would be largely what we showed you when we talked to the Board of Education about where our budget is. We can talk about any particular questions or more information you may want related to that. And then I think largely we wanted to get an idea about what it is in particular you all wanted to talk about or focus on, other than what you see on this tentative agenda. This is just simply a draft that management drew up to try to say these are some of the key areas that we're guessing and thinking that you all may want to hear about. There may be other things that you want to talk about, and that's great too, and we can fit that into the 27th, 1st, or 3rd if necessary. So with that said, David, we can bring up if you can bring up the DPS budget request. And I will say that Durham County's funding from Durham Public Schools wasn't specifically, from a management standpoint, wasn't specifically oriented to any one of their particular requests as they've listed it here. It was about 1.9 million of the 8.99 million that went to current expense funding was supporting the $15 an hour. So there was approximately $7 million, just a hair over $7 million for any one of these needs that DPS might have. We're not in a position for them to choose. Obviously, it doesn't fill all their requested needs. So there may be questions or areas of support that the board may want to add dollars to the manager's recommended budget to support more of these things. Remember, we also added an additional $1.13 million to current capital, bringing that total up to $4.5 million. They requested $6 million. We have been slowly moving toward their full request. It takes time. However, it would take $1.5 million for next year to get to their full current capital expense funding of $6 million. We're currently budgeted at $4.5 million. They had a very late request, and David, this is the right sheet. You'll see one, it came to my attention from Paul Assor at the end of last week, and I sent it to the board as soon as I've got that information on Friday. For nurses and social worker, you see funding for approximately 20 additional school nurses and social workers. The second box down there, David's highlighted it. Thank you. If the board wants to support that, I would strongly encourage discussion about the school nurses in particular being county positions. Gail Harris, if some of you on the board remember, several years ago had set in place a plan to slowly increase the number of school health nurses that the county has to progressively try to get to all public schools. I believe for the last 2 years, we haven't funded it. It wasn't requested, nor has it been funded to add additional school health nurses to the county for this purpose. I will say, if the board is supportive of increasing nurses, school health nurses in particular for DPS, it would be cheaper for us to hire the nurses and have them run out of our department. The reason is every dollar that we give to DPS current expense has a 20%, and I put that in air quotes, surcharge, because we have to give that increase per pupil funding has to also go to charter schools, and charter schools are about 20% of the total cost of our budget. So even if you're funding school health nurses for DPS, you're increasing the overall per pupil expenditure, and it costs us 20% more just to give charter schools that same equivalent dollar. So I would say, if you have an inkling to support additional public health nurses, that we do that on the county side. I did speak with Paul Assor about the social workers, and I think it's only 2 social workers, 2 or 3, that he felt like those would be better oriented towards being in public schools themselves, hired by DPS because of some specialized training that they need. So I just wanted to put that out there. And we can have discussions, or I can ask more questions if you have them of DPS related to that. So again, yes.
Keith, I'm gonna interject. One of the reasons I know that we sort of slowed our pace with adding the nurses was because of the vacancy issues that they were having. And so what we can do is see where we are. We can give the board some information about the nurses that we have funded that support DSS and some of the trends that occurred historically as we added positions, so that you'll also have that history.
So basically what the school system has listed here is a menu of items that relate to their requests, their full request for county funding. And like I said, of the full $18 million, we have funded $7 million plus 1.13 for current capital. So approximately $8.2 million, let's round, of the total $18 million request. So there's another $10 million that they would be happy for you to fund. I will say, from a budget standpoint, and Claudia, feel free to step in, we are limited in the growth dollars that we can find to support this. Any additional dollar that you give schools, either in current expense funding or current capital, is ongoing. It would be forever. So we want to avoid using one-time money, either ARPA funds or fund balance, although some fund balance can be used. We want to avoid trying to fully fund any additional funds for schools that are going to be ongoing costs in perpetuity with one-time dollars this year. So we would like to find an ongoing revenue source to support it. And what's the one main ongoing revenue source that we have? That would probably be property tax revenue related to an additional property tax increase on top of the 1 cent recommended currently. Now there's some nuance in there we can work with, and it just depends on how much money the board wants to discuss giving in addition to what the manager's recommended. And I'll stop there and open it up for board or Claudia.
And so we know this is early in the conversation. What I would suggest is we look at our schedule, that we plug a time also later in our schedule for the board to talk about the levels they may decide to go above what's recommended. We will also bring some strategies, and as Keith said, we would prefer dollars that are recurring. The uniqueness with the availability of ARPA funds to the schools as well as ours, there are situations where there may be a phase strategy in order to soften a tax burden incrementally over time. And so I know that's what we're recommending for some of the potential uses to support DSS in public health, so that we don't get the shock factor of that potential reoccurring expense. Plus, we will have the benefit of looking at, are there operational efficiencies in those outlying years that may allow us to do some realignments. And we do that quite often, as you know. Yes. Ms. Burns?
Commissioner Burns?
Thank you, Chair Howardson and newly interim County Manager Hager. Happy to get the opportunity to say that. Happy that we have a county manager, finally. What I do want to throw out there for those who did not take the time, and I know that that's not county staff, but maybe for some of my colleagues, and that's not saying that you all didn't, who did not take the time last week or 2 weeks ago to look at the budget meeting that the school board had. I will say that I've had discussions with some of my board members, matter of fact, the majority of my board members, about the potential for funding nurses. I hope that those conversations can be ongoing. Keith made a suggestion, much like the one that many of us made, that what we really need to do is look at how we can put these in public health. I think another conversation that was lifted up by both myself, the majority of the board members here, as well as the overarching majority of the board members on the school board, was the funding is not necessarily going to be our biggest issue. I would remind individuals to go back and look at the statements made by board member Raven, as well as board member Javanya Lewis. And I feel pretty confident it's about 5 of them, but I don't want to misspeak, especially not for the public. We have enough people doing that. They pointed out that even if we gave this funding, the big issue that we are going to have is actually being able to staff these on day one. That is a very real issue. Many of you all serve or have sat and listened to updates from Duke Regional as well as Duke Hospital to onboard 50 nurses on day one. It would be a huge undertaking. Right now, one of the reasons why we couldn't do a mega site, not just us, but anyone in the state, was because we didn't have enough community health workers. We didn't have enough nurses. Additionally, what is not discussed about these nurses is the externalities of the supplies that would have to be put in place to surround these individuals so that they could do a great job. On top of that, I'm hopeful that we can offer competitive salaries, because we don't just want any nurses, we want the best nurses for our children. So I just want us to go back, and I want you all to think back to the conversations that you had a couple of weeks ago about how difficult it was going to be to have 20, 50, whatever the number was going to be on day one. And let's really kind of sort of think of a phased approach to bringing these nurses on. And I'm not saying that this is not about, people being fiscally responsible. This is about the fact that right now in New York, in California and Texas, nurses are making $195 an hour still during this pandemic. And we are not in a position to be that competitive. Nobody in the region is in a position to be that competitive. And so I want us to be mindful of that phased approach. And I also want us to be mindful that even when they had that discussion, if you go back and look at it, the idea that they said, well, the county should put in $2 million. They encumbered $2 million of our $6 million without discussion with us, which is fine because they're allowed to discuss things. But the other issue is we don't even know, Keith made a great point, these individuals, will it be long-term? There's people who come into state jobs all the time, I'm doing this full-time, time limited for 2 or 3 years. So are we doing this full-time? Is this full-time, time limited? And the last thing I will say, when we look at some of these information technology costs, the additional annual IT refresh costs, there is space, if I'm not mistaken right now, in some of the ARPA funding for that. Additionally, there is space for some of the part-time custodial work in the ARPA funding. I don't want to, and I'm saying that today at 1:21 p.m. because it could easily change at 5. So as we seek to be creative over these coming days and weeks, as much as we are putting this on our budget staff, I encourage my board to be just as creative. And I know that you all are, because I've talked to some of you all, but you have been mighty silent over these last few meetings, especially when it came to the nurses and the social workers, because it's become a bit of a third rail. The healthcare of our students shouldn't be a third rail. We all know that there's going to be an issue with onboarding on the first day. And I think a phased approach would be the best approach. And I agree, as Keith pointed out, and as 3 or 4 of you have even discussed with me, what we need to do is to put these in public health, point blank period, so that our public schools get the access. And so I'm going to stop there with my comments about it. And I appreciate you, Keith, David, and Interim Manager Hager for bringing forth this presentation. And I do, Keith, you pointed it out at the last meeting, and I pointed out here, our county's budget staff recommendation is based on what they got from everyone. We did not get some of these additions until after the county manager had embargo conversations with our members. And then those embargoes were broken, and then additional things were added. So I don't want you all to beat up on our staff when they worked very hard on this for months on end based on the recommendations that we gave them. So again, I thank you for your hard work. And as always, I'm dedicated to defending your work.
Thank you, Commissioner Burns. I concur with what you're saying, that I've had the same conversations with you and the health and the school board members, some of the school board members as well, about strategy, about how do we make this happen, and it needs to happen, and just how do you make it happen with a structure. Through the health department, I think it's a great idea for it to happen. I've served on the Board of Health since I was elected, and appreciate Gail Harris' recommendation and working on the commitment to have nurses in every school. That's a commitment that she had and the health department still have today. So I think it would be a great idea to do that rather than just put nurses out there, and having conversations, as you said, with Duke, UNC. They're offering all kinds of incentives to get nurses, and we cannot offer those kinds of incentives to nurses as county government. So I think that's a conversation that we need to consider, how we structure that. My other question, and I think that this was mentioned this morning, the operational services around custodial services, and was that mentioned this morning as the conversation that needs to be had again about how that's funded? Yeah.
One of the things that we talked about from the county budget development is that for those kinds of expenses, we did use ARPA dollars as a way to fund them. Part of it is that we anticipated that hopefully in 3 years, the level of a cleaning level that's required for COVID would have decreased because Hopefully the pandemic will be totally gone by then. But if not, we would use a phased approach in how we would start applying that, the permanent dollar. So for instance, I believe we budgeted 1.2 million for the janitorial needs. And we are projecting to use the ARPA dollars to cover that. That takes pressure off the tax base. As we go into the next couple of years, we'll gauge levels, and then we can incrementally change it. If, for instance, we see next year, this time, we're at the same place we are this year, this time or worse, and we can start then strategizing like, wow, it's at a level we need to start applying some local dollars to it so we don't have the shock factor in year 4. The strategy of not using the ARPA funds for reoccurring expenses is a great one. If you plan though, you can leverage it so that you aren't hitting your local tax base as hard. And so that's a common practice with grant funds anyway. But that was our thought process with that, as well as a couple of other areas.
Okay, thank you. Those were my questions now for this graph. I'm sure there are other questions as well. Other questions from other commissioners? Commissioner Jacobs.
Thank you, Madam Chair. And so Keith,
Commissioner Lom, I see you. Oh.
Keith and Claudia, first of all, I just want to thank you. I appreciate the way that your recommendations about strategies, financing strategies to try to meet some of these important needs. And so Claudia, I appreciate what you just said about, the great thing about the ARPA money is the fact that it really could be extended over the next 3 budgets that we have through 2024. And I think that's a great strategy that you all are thinking about. Related to the school nurses, I think we're all agree that this is a really important need. And I believe it would be really helpful to know what the actual, the goal is, I think, to have at some point a school nurse in every school. I know that was Gail Harris's vision, and we can all understand why. And so I would, if you all could find out exactly how many nurses how many schools we're currently serving, and what the actual need will be to fully fund it. I think that the request for 20, which I think, Keith, you're saying that 18 of them are nurses and maybe 2 social workers. If we could find out what that breakdown is, but that this is actually part of phasing it in, that doing just the 18 is obviously just a first step, for looking at a plan over time. And I don't know, maybe you all can even be talking to the schools and come back to the school staff with a plan at some point of how we can eventually get to fully providing school nurses, working together, that you all could bring back to both boards about how we get to that over time. And I agree that it makes total sense to do this through our public health department.
Commissioner Jacobs, not to cut you off, it's just germane to something that you said, and I think it would be helpful.
Sure.
If I'm not mistaken, during their budget meeting, and I would encourage everybody to go back, I think the 20, now I could be wrong, but the 20 that is listed here, they were going halvesies, if that makes any sense. Whereas they would take some of their funding and pay for some, and we would take some of our funding. So I don't think that this is and then they also had a series of FTE nurses that during the hiring freeze, they had not hired. So I do think that this number is not indicative to the entire number of the batch of nurses that they thought. So I do want to throw that out there, that it's not just this 20.
Okay, yeah, so it'd be great to understand what the whole vision is. you know, for this, for the school nurses. And then I guess the other big, and also Claudia, I appreciate you pointing out about, and Chair Howerton brought it up too, about, you know, using the ARPA money for, you know, some of those key areas like the custodial staff. I think the one, and then the other one that jumped out at me, I brought this up this morning, of course, is broadband, and, you know, IT. And I actually hope that that's one of my questions for us to revisit with our board is addressing the needs that we have countywide with possibly some of the ARPA money. But the one area I think I would like us to be able, and we don't have to do this now, but I think I am concerned about some of the academic needs. I know Commissioner Carter put it in the chat, you know, related to the supporting English language learners and some of the other those needs under the academic and administrative services, us trying to look at those, because unfortunately the state formula is insufficient and does not meet the needs that we have in this area. So I'll just stop there. And I know that it's going to be challenging because, as you said, Claudia, we either, or maybe Keith said it, we either find the money within our own budget by looking carefully at what's in the recommended budget and reallocating, or we look at the ARPA money, or we look at it at fund balance or tax increase. It's not like we can just all of a sudden have it come out of thin air. So I do think we do have some conversations ahead of us. Thank you.
Commissioner Long.
Thank you, Chair Howerton, and thank you, Manager Hager and Keith and David, for all of your work on this presentation, also your presentation this morning. I had submitted most of my question to y'all, so I won't ask hopefully too many questions, but one did just pop up into my head as we were talking about bringing nurses in-house on the county side. I was just wondering, is that something that we could also possibly do with custodial services? And obviously that's a conversation also to have with the school board members if it's something that they would actually like, but just wondering since we have to give like a certain percentage of every per pupil investment to charter schools.
I am not sure if that would be as efficient, because the way that works is that the public health director actually manages those the nurses, and for that scenario, it would have the individuals would be managed by our general services, and so I don't think that would work the same unless, you know, contractually, because we do our janitorial services a little bit differently. We did a pilot, and we did a pilot to see if we could bring in-house our janitorial services. And I think we did the courthouse, if I'm not mistaken. And with that pilot, we were going to determine if we want to scale it to a larger level and have the day porters managed by our general services department versus having contractual services. We found that from the pilot that it was more difficult for us to do it that way because of the turnover that happens often. We ended up having to have more people to make sure we had that continuity of service, and the contractors were just able to perform that easier for us. And so DPS did they switched from having contractual to having in-house. And I think I know they are at a different place in it, but I know they experienced some of the challenges that we did with it. So that one may be trickier, and it would be best that they fund it, but they could use their ARPA dollars as a way of covering it during this period if they were doing contractual or time limited so that they could gauge, well, what's the need? But they may be deciding, as it sounded like this morning, they're trying to do to a higher level overall of building support. So we would have to talk with them about that more. All right, I think it sounds like we have covered all of the comments that we can do follow up with. I'm sorry, Commissioner Carter.
That's okay, not a problem. Mostly I just want to affirm what everyone has been saying. Wholeheartedly support getting as many nurses into schools as quickly as we can, and absolutely always support doing it in a way that makes financial good sense. And if we don't have to do the charter school surtax, then that's certainly the way to go, in the similar fashion that we did with the SROs, taking that out of the school district's budget and instead putting it into the county budget in the office of the sheriff. Speaking of SROs, I hope that we will soon, sort of following the school board's lead, also probably in cooperation with our community safety and wellness task force, have a discussion about that $2+ million in funding to just decide as a community if we think that armed law enforcement in the schools, that they provide safety support. They also do definitely form relationships with students that are really vital and important. But, I think that the community wants to have a conversation about that, and that could possibly open up some funding. So that would be interesting to see in the future. I also just wanted to add that I really appreciate the recommendation from the manager, to fund what felt like a pretty good chunk of the school board's request. Looking at it again today, it feels like that we're definitely funding the increased cost for salary and benefits and the fixed cost increases, the enrollment growth and adjustments, those things that are kind of continuation costs that we would expect to fund. And then we're increasing capital by 1.13 million, which is great. I question whether it's enough still. It may be all we can do, but I really am eager to look at the per square foot expenditure of the county and compare it to the schools and see if there's a way to be on equal footing there. But I am worried about the academic and administrative services requests that we're not funding. They seem really important to me, especially support for students with disabilities and English language learners, and having additional folks in that multilingual resource center. I know I've talked to Alexandra Valladares, or I've heard her speak about this and the importance of that particular line item for our Latinx and Hispanic and other language speaking students, immigrant students. And I know that we want to do all we can to fund that portion of the Durham Public School Strategic Plan. And then just, I'm highly aware, because of our own needs lately, of ongoing information technology funds that are needed in order to have these refreshes and in order to be sure your network equipment and everything is secure and as up to date as it can be and is protected and all that. And so I just am unsure about how those needs are going to be met. Hopefully there might be some way through some of our federal funding between the two bodies, the school board and our own. So those are just some, comments as much as anything. I feel like I'm sort of rambling, but wanted a chance to say some of that. I do have some more questions about some other areas of our budget, but I'll hold on those. If you want to hear from us about some other things we might want to hear about in the future, I'll hold on those.
Okay. Now, are there other questions on this topic? And so we can then shift to some other general topics as we plan the rest of the time that we have to discuss the budget. Okay, so Keith, we can take this slide down. And we can open up the discussion for other general topics that you may have right now. And as I shared, we will have a time, well, I did not share this. I know we're gonna get your questions, so that will help us too. But at the end of each work session, we will also have a time period that commissioners can talk about other areas that they'd like to work, to have more insight on. Keith? Keith, I saw your hand.
Claudia, just before we leave schools completely, just want to relay to make sure David and I understand and our budget office understands. And by the way, thank you for thanking David and I, but it's not just he and I that produce budget information and presentations and all that. It is budget staff, it is management, it's lots of other people. So we appreciate you thanking us, but let's make sure that all the other staff involved are recognized as well. And so thank you, Anna, Jonathan, Matt, Shannon in our office, and Bethany, who just left for greener pastures. So about DPS, I want to make sure we are going to come back to DPS. We're going to talk to DPS about school nurses, how many we have in our public health department right now, how many they would need in full, what this request was for 18, and what. So we'll try to give you a fuller picture of what that means. And I heard Commissioner Burns talk about the struggle to do to even hire nurses. We will talk with Rod about that and try to get a true legitimate what we could hire and what would actually be available by July the 1st and January the 1st. And we'll adjust and try to give some funding estimate on what the county could legitimately carry out and do in a reasonable amount. And so when we come back, we'll give you a brief report on that. We also, Commissioner Alam, I heard you talk about staff, cleaning staff. We'll ask DPS how many cleaning staff are actually on staff and what they do about that, and get a little bit of clarification on that additional funding they're asking for next year, whether that could be ARPA funded. Is it related to extra cleaning or just increased number of schools? But we'll get some clarification on that for you. So we'll leave with those two. I'm walking out of the DPS discussion we just had with those two major issues as something we'll come back to you with. Is that okay? Am I missed anything from any commissioner as it relates to that? Commissioner Carter.
Just to, whether or not it's possible to get a per pupil, not per pupil, per square foot expenditure on ongoing capital needs.
And for some reason, I think we did that a couple of years ago. So but we'll definitely pull that information together.
Claudia, Manager Hager, apologize. The conversation has happened with kind of a DPS and our General Services Department about the square footage. Mm-hmm. One of those is always the kind of the apples to apples comparison and how to really make sure we're counting the cost, same cost they are. So I'll work with our General Services Department. We know a very good former budget analyst there who maybe get them connected with some of the DPS team and maybe try to make sure we're getting towards that apples to apples. So we have a really good number on that.
Very good.
Looks like Keith was frozen.
He went away. He's back.
Yeah, he's coming. He's coming back.
Okay.
Sorry, I didn't hear that. I had to get kicked off. I kicked off. I'm secretly in a different country right now. And so it's amazing that I can even talk to you at all. Technology is amazing. So we're making do right now.
That's all right. That's all right. We have that information, Keith, but it was regarding the comparison of square footage cost and for DPS and Durham County with facility needs.
I hope that Commissioner Carter will let us define those rules a little bit, because I don't know if school square footage is the same thing as county building square footage versus the type of building. So let us look into that, and we will definitely try to get you an answer, but I just want to make sure that the methodology we use is fair to everyone involved.
Well, Keith, you will be proud to know David shared similar highlights. So I'm glad y'all all on the same.
That's why we work so well. Thanks.
All right, so next, just trying to get a gauge from the commissioners of other topics that you may like to discuss. And I know Commissioner Carter, you said that you had a few that you wanted to bring up, and we can take those now.
Okay. Madam Chair, may I just jump in?
Sure.
Okay, thank you. I know that there is a lot of community conversation and that there has been outreach to us from community members about increased funding for sort of upstream safety and wellness fostering services, positions, initiatives. And so I'm interested in that, of course. I know we all are, which is why we have the new Safety and Wellness Task Force. And I know we're all looking forward to hearing from them. They're just getting their work underway. And when I talked with the Durham Beyond Policing and the Durham for All group, I think they had us all in a one-on-one conversation over Zoom about some of their requests. I mentioned that I think will be really important for us, the City Council, the school board, and our body to hear from them, as they assess sort of what's happening now currently in this space, where there may be gaps, where we may be able to shift some resources towards fewer armed law enforcement responders and maybe more clinician type responders, but that we really have yet to hear from them. I was also thinking about how we have a number of safety and wellness initiatives underway in the county, and I'm just wondering if it would be possible to highlight those in a way that it probably would pull from different departments. A number of them may very well be in Gudrun's wheelhouse and the Criminal Justice Resource Center, but others as well. Would there be a way to pull that together into a single category that had to do with safety and wellness, so that we could say, as a matter of sort of just educating the community about what's going on, being sure we all know as individual commissioners what's going on in this sort of area. Because the request is that we shift some funding from the Office of the Sheriff to more mental health resource support, or more counselors and clinicians like nurses and social workers in our schools. We certainly have not heard from the sheriff about that. And I'm sure that would be concerning to start moving positions until we have some assessment of what all the positions are currently doing. What are some other needs that we may have? We don't want to shift funding away from the sheriff and leave a void that we actually need. And so I'm trying to get my head wrapped around this situation, this dilemma.
Okay. All right, and so it sounds like, and I know I'll ask Jody to help weigh in on this one, but it sounds as though there's desire, and it is a need for us to make sure the board is clear about the dollars that are in those areas, because some have such distinct purposes that it's not feasible for that approach to occur. However, it may be a way to address other issues that are pressing once they're defined.
So Claudia, let me just interject for a minute. And then I want Commissioner Burns to talk a little bit about the fact that she's on that committee. She serves as our liaison. So Gudrun gave an excellent report of mapping of the services that we have to that group the other night. I don't know if any of you had an opportunity to watch, but Commissioner Burns was there and talk about mapping to see what are the services that we already have to try and see where the gaps are. And in talking with the chairs and the co-chairs, they talked about that they really need some time for the group to identify where the gaps. Right now, they're just beginning to do their work. And what Gudrun showed them was reflective of what's happening from the criminal justice side, and also they begin to do some work around what's happening in the community. Like, what do we already have and what's needed? And I think that's some work that really needs to be done before we start to do things that we don't even know where the need really is. We know that there's going to be a drastic need around mental health. I've talked to the State Association of Counties, and we know that coming out of this pandemic, there's a lot of need around mental health. But we also want to be smart and strategic about where we invest the dollars rather than just putting it out there and don't know where the best avenue is. So I'd like to hear from Commissioner Burns about her reflection from what Gudrun showed the other night. Commissioner Burns.
No, I'm coming off of mute. I had already started talking, so I do appreciate you. And I thank you for the opportunity to be the liaison there. And I've tried to be responsive to the requests that have been made of me. And one of the things that I want to throw out, even before we give out any information about that perspective, is a little bit of context, because I think that is sorely lacking in this conversation, especially since we don't have anybody from BYP here, nor do we have anybody from the sheriff's office. And we are sitting here strategically trying to gut one's budget to fund another. And one of the things that I would point out is I did add, someone made a statement a second ago that they've not been heard. I don't know if I can say that when I know that one of the beautiful things that this board has done, and I don't know if everyone has, but I have it on good authority. Every person here has given them an audience. So unlike many groups in Durham, I can think of many, especially many Black groups who have gotten zero audience. BYP has gotten an audience with every single person on this board, which I'm proud to say that has happened. I'm not proud to see that so many Black groups have been ignored purposefully for a year, but I'm happy to see that BYP, along with Durham for All, because everybody should be heard equally and equitably. What I will say is we had the opportunity to talk to them, and one of the issues that was brought up, or one of the concerns that was brought up, was they wanted to move positions from one department to another department. As we sit here and we want to talk about moving departments, we have to be very honest about it would take, 10 legislative changes to even develop this wellness department that they're talking about. Not all of them would have to occur, but there are certain charters that mandate what law enforcement officers can and can't do, and who can and cannot show up to certain calls, whether they be traffic incidences or incidences of domestic violence. So as we're moving money, we need to make sure that we can legally move money. I will state that I did ask those individuals, a wonderful, beautiful group of young people that I admire. I said, hey, does it have to be 10%? Could it be 5%? And they said, what are we looking at? What are we willing to give? So there was some movement there. I think another point that I brought up, I said, well, do we actually have to move all of it from the sheriff's office? Because as you can see, the sheriff did ask for some mental health specialists. He has sexual assault counselors there, individuals, the there are a couple other positions, FTEs, that he's had in the mental health space that he couldn't fill. And they said, well, we don't necessarily know if it should be there because $6 million is all that was given to mental health. And that's when I had to say, hey, let me provide a little bit of context. And one of the things that I provided was, it looks like we only gave $6 million of mental health. That is not what we did. I could do a good example. If we look at the line item that we have for women's health, it would almost it would highlight the same. It would kind of sort of highlight the same thing. It didn't look like we do a lot, but we have gynecologists throughout county government. We have mental health specialists throughout county government. We have psychiatrists that are in the police department. And the reason why you want to have those individuals in there, and I know I got to hurry up here, Madam Chair, in the event somebody comes into the jail and they're manic or they're brought in, I actually like the fact that we can sit there with this individual who might have assaulted someone, who might be going through a mental break, we're able to do an assessment. And this person that comes in, we can find out if they're on drugs and get them on naloxone. We can find out if this woman is pregnant and we can get her prenatal care. We can find out if this individual right now has actually been wounded and we can get them sutured. And so you won't see those line items in public health. You won't see that gynecologist line item in public health. You won't see that psychiatrist line item in mental health, but nonetheless, those resources are there. So one of the things I kind of agree somewhat with Commissioner Carter, that we do need to have a full outlay that shows actually it's not $6 million, but close to $30 or $40 million that we put into mental health so that we can have a real conversation about this. And I would also argue that one of the other things that we should work on when Gudrun mapped these things out, she did do a decent job of mapping and saying we have these resources here. And the last thing that I stated with them, and this was not on a meeting, this is in a private meeting that I have, I would love to see some direct requests for them. We all know that a psychiatrist is going to run us $200,000 to $225,000. So if you're asking for $3.7 million, have you thought about what that personnel looks like? Have you thought about what those benefits look like? Have you thought about what that team looks like? Because what I don't want to see is $2 million or $3.7 million be taken away and then it be put into some working group, especially when these individuals are looking for a department or looking for some real resources. So I'm hopeful that those conversations can be ongoing so that we could come up with something real, something manifest, so that it's not just we took something away from one budget to put here and then nothing came out of it. I think that would be a disservice to these young people who've worked very hard. But again, having this conversation as a vacuum is also not helpful. So I will end there.
Madam Chair, just real quick, I just want to highlight, I believe we all agree here. And when we do agree, I want to lift that up. I never intended for anyone to understand me to say I wanted to gut the sheriff's budget.
I didn't say you.
What I asked instead was, could we please package the many things that I know we are doing so that we can, each of us can understand it very well. I know my understanding may not be as vast as some others here, and that's, I'd like to learn more, but also B, so our community will see exactly what Commissioner Burns said, the many things we already are doing that may not actually fall into Alliance's line item, or they actually may fall into the sheriff's line item. That was my main request, and I'm glad that we agree. I agree with Commissioner Howerton that our group, the Safety and Wellness Task Force, is just getting off the ground, and how important that group is. We spent over a year developing their bylaws and selecting them, and I really want to hear from them especially. But an assessment of need, this mapping, maybe Gudrun could come to one of our budget work sessions if that would be of interest to others. It would be to me. And hear more about this mapping. And also it would be a way of sharing it with the public. Thank you.
Commissioner Howerton, I just want to correct for the public that I was answering the question that you directed at me. You asked me to go over what I discussed with BYP, what we discussed with wellness and what we discussed with Gudrun. And in the 6 minutes that I took, I went through all three of those things, and none of my comments were directed at any individual, no matter how fragile. And again, as you continue to ask me questions, I'm going to do my best to answer those as openly and honestly as humanly possible. So thank you for that opportunity, Commissioner Howerton.
Thank you, Commissioner Burns and Commissioner Carter. I concur with both of you that Gudrun, we could ask Gudrun to do a presentation for us, but in the end, what she said was there was more to her mapping that that they pulled together that didn't get implemented because of the pandemic started. So there is still more to be refined or researched, and I think the Safety and Wellness Task Force talked a little bit about there may be a need to have someone do that research for them or with them. And we can have conversation with the task force, the chairs or the members to determine what it is that they would prefer. Commissioner Jacobs.
Thank you. Yeah, I just wanted to follow up on this. I think this is a very important conversation and related to our budget as well. And I know Chair Howerton, you and I actually had a conversation about this issue and how it would really be helpful to have some type of a feasibility study. Where maybe feasibility isn't the right word, but a study of really what are our existing resources, what are the gaps? I guess the word is maybe gaps analysis. What is our gaps analysis in terms of our current crisis response system that we have in Durham? Because and we're all in different conversations, right? And so in terms of the meetings that I've been in with the Stepping Up Initiative and also part of another grant called the Social Justice Partnership, they're all looking at different pieces of this issue. And when I was on the Criminal Justice Advisory Committee, is that there has been some preliminary mapping done, and that may be what she shared with the the Community Wellness and Safety Task Force. And we do have some amazing, great resources happening, and they are in different parts of our budget and in different departments. But there are gaps. And from my understanding is that current staff do not have the capacity to do this. You know, people are overworked, they're burdened. And so this may be a way that we can contribute in our upcoming budget. I know that the city has allocated and set aside money for the Community Wellness and Safety Task Force. We haven't. So maybe, you know, it's something that we could consider as our contribution is funding a gaps analysis of our current mental health resources, of our current crisis response system. So that was going to be something that I actually put out as something to possibly consider as something that we fund in our upcoming budget to help support all these different conversations and things to be considered. So I will stop there.
So Claudia, I guess where we, and the board can interject, but I think where we are is that there has to be more conversation with the Safety Wellness Task Force to understand what it is that they want and what's needed. You know, I know that there was a $2 million set aside with the city to do work for the safety committee task force. And we've got also look to see how we're going to manage. We've got two task force beginning to happen. We've got the Racial Equity Commission task force and what we're going to do there. And then the safety committee. So I would ask that you have a conversation with the co-chairs so that we on the right page with the task force to see what it is that they really want us to participate in. Does that make sense?
Yes, that does.
Thank you.
All right. So we can definitely follow up on that. This has been a rich discussion.
Thank you.
Very rich one.
Commissioner Jacobs.
I just want to make sure that Commissioner Carter was finished with anything. I know we started out this discussion with Manager Hager asking us what are other topics that we discuss. And I have some things that I wanted to share, but I just wanted to make sure that she wasn't done with her request yet.
I mean, I could email this in, or I mean, I'll just list off a few other things. I'd like to know a little bit more about pre-K investment this year. You know, we didn't hear from Linda Chappelle today. I couldn't tell if she was on the agenda or not, but anyway, that might be an area of mutual widespread interest. The early childhood action plan and the sustainability plan, will there be implementation costs associated with that? That's all. Thank you.
All right. Thank you.
Okay, go ahead, Commissioner Jacobs.
Thank you. And I concur with those requests. Actually, that was on my list. I feel like, I don't want us to lose sight of what has been one of our major board initiatives, which is investing in early childhood and, all of the upstream investments that we're making. I just think it's really important that, we don't, with the pandemic and all of the kind of recovery needs, that we don't lose sight of this being a very important investment for our board. And then with the early childhood action plan, just understanding, I think what we heard was that there was going to be, that they were going to come back to us with what they might need for implementation. I would like to understand, exactly kind of where we are right now with early childhood. I know there's been, from what I've been reading, that our early childhood system has really been hit by the pandemic because women have been really impacted by COVID and have had the biggest losses of women coming out of the workforce. And our child care network has been really devastated. But at the same time, we need to have a good child care and early childhood system, or else women won't be able to go back to work. I would like to, I hope we can spend some time during the budget just getting kind of talking about all of this, and just also our investment with Reach Out and Read and some of the other programs that we have been investing in that are related to early childhood. The other thing for me is the implementation of the aging plan. I know when we heard a recommendation and we heard the update from the aging plan, we asked them to bring back to us, what do we need? It sounded like they needed one staff position to implement it. So again, when we do these plans, we really have to think about how are we going to implement them. So and that's a personal priority for me relating to our aging residents. So I would like to hear more about that. And then I think the third big thing for me is I would really love to hear from Deborah. I know she's been working so hard on a language equity plan. I want to support her and the staff in that. And also I think for me related to that is the whole broadband issue as well. Just the idea about communication, access to information, just a bigger picture. I was very surprised. Well, I shouldn't be very surprised, but the workers' town hall and the workers' survey that was done, the results of that survey about how, and we all know this, how people don't know, and I talked to you about this, Manager Hager, people don't know about the resources that we have. And when I asked Chanel Croxton about, their recommendations about how do we do a better job on that, her response was two things. One, using trusted community partners, and we're doing that now with the ERAP program. We are partnering with trusted community partners to help implement the program. The other thing she mentioned was, Facebook ads, but just us really looking at how we can make sure we're getting information and resources out to the community is a big question mark for me. And so that still is connected to internet, because if you don't have internet, you're not getting all of our great social media, and then you can, other things, and then the whole language equity piece as well. So those are kind of the big, some of the big things, and other things I'm just going to follow up with through email. So thank you.
So Claudia, did we jump ahead of your next presentation?
No, we did not. This
Okay.
This was a free flow for us to gauge how do we strategize for the
Okay.
next meetings. It's a real important part of our planning so that
Okay,
coordinate with all of the other entities.
I was just looking at the agenda and it said budget overview from 2 to 3. And I just wanted to make sure that we didn't jump ahead of it. Then it said board discussion. It's like, okay, did we just jump ahead of your presentation or what?
No, ma'am, you
Okay.
are right on target because we discussed so much of that budget conversation in the morning session.
Okay.
We're not gonna go into that today. One thing I will note about the budget one though, is that as we work towards the end of the fiscal year, we will always revisit where we are with our projections so that if there are ways to refine our numbers to generate additional dollars based on the current, the most recent information, we would make those adjustments. And that's a natural, I mean, that's a normal process. It doesn't generate a whole bunch, but every small incremental amount helps as we're trying to close gaps.
Okay. And I guess, one of the things that's been important to Commissioner Burns and myself is Black maternal health. And I know that that's a conversation that's coming up in the next, at the next session.
Yes, ma'am. That is a planned discussion for us to talk about the framework that's in place and sort of next steps.
Yeah, that's a huge conversation in the community as well. Trying to think of ones that have not been mentioned. For me, broadband has already been mentioned, especially in the northern parts of our county. Sometimes we just we don't show them any love. We need to show them more love in that part of the county.
And again, we will have a strategy, at least to share right now. Thank goodness for the ARPA funds and some other resources that have become available in recent months. So we're excited. I still, like y'all, get calls from some of our residents in the northern community every so often to see if we've made any headway. And so we definitely see that as a priority and something that we will discuss.
And I'll think about others, but I know that there's a conversation around transit, commuter rail, that is going to come to us from a citizen in the community. And you'll hear more about that when she comes to present or she send her information. But I think she's probably going to come and talk about what her concerns are around this budget. That's all I have for now. I'll think about what else I want to put out there. Anything else from any other commissioners? I see no hands, so I'm gonna turn it back to you, Claudia, and your staff.
Okay. I think from our perspective, we have what we need to strategically plan for the rest of the sessions. We have quite a few topics. Some are maybe more complex than others, but we'll give you an update on how we will proceed with them. And
just one other thing. One of the things that I have a bit of concern too is the way in which we use coordinators. I really want us to look at how we are appointing and using coordinators. That is it the most feasible economic way in which we do that? I'd like for staff to really, because we appoint a coordinator to everything. I mean, to everything we hire a coordinator. And are we using those funds equitably? Are we using them to the best way that, because sometimes we have separate coordinators that could be combined to do the same work. But we are hiring, and we have individual coordinators, and I just feel like some of them could be combined. I'd like for us to take a look at how we're doing that work.
Now, that would require a workload analysis and assessments or programs. So
Okay.
this is something that we can put on our list after we get past the budget season.
Okay, yeah, it might require a little bit more work than during the budget period. Okay, cool.
That's a
All
great.
right. Yeah, that's all for me for now. Okay.
All right, well, Keith and David, I believe we have what we need from our perspective. Did y'all have any other areas you needed to cover?
I'll bring up one while Keith is
No,
either.
ma'am, just-
Okay. Okay.
The one area I'll bring up is, this is just mostly an FYI for the commissioners. Traditionally, our office collects comments through the citizen comment portal on the budget website. We will send those emails out to you once we start receiving significant comments, which sometimes happens in large amounts overnight, sometimes kind of sporadic. But we'll start sending those emails out to you on a fairly regular basis once they start coming in regularly. And it'll be a link to a web page where you can search them and view all of the comments individually or kind of consolidated, however you like. But that'll start coming. My guess is in the next week or so, when the comments start coming in. And this, they'll also be collected as part of the, I think next Mondays, if I'm correct, regular session is the public hearing on the budget. So we'll be sending out some of those communications in advance of that as well.
Okay, so are we all clear? Something else for you, Keith? Okay.
Commissioner Howerton, thank you. Just want to make sure to remind the commissioners to send in questions. If you have questions about the manager's recommended budget, or you don't feel like you thought of some things since today's meeting, please write them in an email and send them to the budget office, and we will collect them all and work with Claudia and other departments to get answers to your questions. I know some commissioners are used to this, Commissioner Lom, Commissioner Burns. Feel free to send 10, 15, 20, however many questions you have about budget issues, and we'll collate them and work with Claudia, as she said, to continue trying to fix and push the priorities out to the right budget work sessions upcoming. Thank you.
We're gonna have a 20 limit question. I'm just messing.
You remember what happened when you gave us a limit during the budget retreat?
Just one other question. One other question, Claudia. Is there anything in the budget, and I haven't seen it, and because I asked Deborah Craig Ray around our studio video, camera video. Is there
A new studio. Yeah.
studio? Yeah. Is there anything in the budget for that?
Harry can.
I know she wanted a comms person and the videographer was in there. I think some people tried to take it away from her though.
Deborah, you can go ahead with the update.
Okay, I will start. Perry and I actually have been meeting with some vendors to look at making some improvements, enhancements in the studio to include purchasing cameras. Apparently we had some funding left from another capital project, is my understanding. But we've been working with our current vendor and also working with the city because they want to also use our facility. And we had actually talked about sharing that before the pandemic. You may not know this, but we actually have an interlocal agreement that we pay them to air our programs. And so we were going to do sort of a no money swap. I was going to have them use our studio and then we wouldn't have to pay them to broadcast our shows. But again, that was pre-pandemic. So I just wanted to let you know. But we are working on trying to enhance the studio itself from top to bottom. And I'll let Perry just kind of talk briefly about what we looked at.
Deborah, you nailed it. Good afternoon, everyone.
Good afternoon.
So yeah, Deborah, you're spot on. We actually had some funding left over in the Admin 2 renovation that we were looking to fit up that TV studio. And as Deborah mentioned, we're in the process of meeting with the city, with J&A Engineering, O'Brien Atkins, and others. We actually have another follow-up meeting tomorrow just to make sure that we have the scope properly identified to be able to allow full functionality of the city's operations based on the upcoming lease requirement that Deborah just mentioned that she's going to enter with them. So you'll be seeing something coming forward shortly once we finalize the package and go out for bids. We will be bringing that to you to complete that portion of the project. So thank you.
Thank you. The part of process improvement as we try to do in our organization. Thank you.
Thank you, Deborah and Perry. Great to know. Thank you. All right, that's it for me for now. Anything else for anyone else? If not, we can adjourn, and we're back on, when are we back, Claudia?
We come back on the 27th for the budget work session.
Okay,
You have a public hearing on the 24th.
the public hearing is on the 24th. Okay.
Yes.
So we are adjourned.
Thank you.